So I've talked a little bit about my panel in the past, but let me give you an example of a very common problem I have. One way to put philosophy is the examination of knowledge. Now that sounds like it would line very closely to psychology, the examination of human nature, but the reality is that a lot of times it doesn't. So at my panels, many times I'm asked a psychological question, such as, spoilers, what was up with Shinji masturbating over Asuka in the end of Evangelion? While I'm able to answer this question, it doesn't really fall into the realm of philosophy. The major difference, if you ask me, is that if you examine the thoughts and the context of a character, you tend to end up with philosophy, and if you examine the why of the character's actions, you tend to get psychology. That being said, let me tell you another story. Tokyo and Tulsa, 2009. I'm giving my panel, and it's going great. I've just philosophized Code Geass, and I'm feeling pretty good about my answer, when suddenly a hand shoots up and asks me about Elfen lied. To which I pause for a moment and I think. Then, with some level of disappointment in my voice, I said, well, I could tell you about the philosophy of the show, but I'm going to promise you that it's the psychology that's more interesting. However, she insisted, so I told her my thoughts, asked her what she thought, and she had nothing to say back to me. So call this a personal vendetta, but I'm going to attack the philosophy of this show again. And what's more, I'm going to try and blend the psychology in with it. This is a bit loony, I know, but this is a tough anime to get at cons, and it's time I faced it head on. Now, I considered hitting a plot summary here right quick, but if you ask me, the plot to this story is actually kind of unimportant. What makes the show interesting to watch is putting two of the characters together and seeing what reaction you get from the two. It's like a science lab, but the chemicals are people. So as always, spoilers as I hit my rule of 3. So, on the broad, Elfen Lied is about helplessness. To be specifically broad, it's about what the helpless do to stop being helpless. Consider every single character in the show. Each one is helpless as a situation rolls over them, either that happens now or in the past, and each one of them find a way to combat that as best they can. Lucy is the hardest of all the characters to pin down all the ways that she's helpless in, and the way she fights, but I'm gonna try, in list form. So number 1, Lucy is helpless to her own guilt, but fights it with New. Lucy is helpless to express herself to Kota, she fights this by not killing him. Lucy is unable to make meaningful connections, she fights this with her disregard for human life. And most importantly, Lucy is helpless to change who she is on a biological level. She fights this with all of the above actions. Shoot man, this girl has some baggage. Now I could go through the helpless and fighting qualities of each character, but really that sounds really boring. Anyway, if we took an aesthetic approach to the show, we get a very similar theme. The show uses little girls with pink hair as the central empowered characters. Well, what does this say? Well, little girls are supposed to be helpless and weak, but in this case they are more or less the most deadly things around. You might say the little pink-haired girls fight their helpless appearance by being deadly. In the Elfen Lied universe, if you see a pink-haired little girl, you're in trouble. Now, it's actually to my disappointment, the show never says anything particularly insightful about weakness or feeling helpless. The show instead chooses to show us the hows and whys. How did this character come to be? Why is she so angry at humans? And so on. In essence, we understand the weakness of the characters, but never get a solid resolution on their issues. But that's why this is my broad question. Because, specifically, the show deals with... well, it's actually a pretty textbook example of reality and pleasure principle. Let me explain a little. Reality principle is a Freudian psychology term meaning basically that an individual gives up current satisfaction for the possibility of future satisfaction. And pleasure principle is the opposite, taking current satisfaction while giving up the possibility of future satisfaction. In general, I know some psych major is going to yell at me for this. But what does the show have to do with the two principles? Well, let's take an example of both right out of the show. Pleasure principle. Kota and Yuka sacrifice the possible awkwardness and strangeness of a future situation for the immediate satisfaction of kissing each other. This ends poorly for them, as do almost all of the pleasure principles in the show. Okay, reality principle then. Lucy sacrifices her own happiness and indeed even her own sanity in an attempt to make Kota happy, in hopes perhaps that they can someday be together. This also ends poorly, as do most reality principle attempts in the show. Well, what's this saying then? Personally, I get a very nihilistic feel from the show. Nihilism is yet another branch of philosophy that basically seeks to show the lack of meaning in particular aspects of life, Generally, a nihilist is someone who believes that life and existence in general are completely without meaning. If you ask me, that fits Elfen Lied pretty well. So I guess this is a good time for recommended reading. Okay, guys. I do not recommend Nietzsche. His works have been corrupted by his sister, he can be very hard to understand, and he's generally only enjoyed by pretentious hipster guys. Look, if you're gonna read anything by Nietzsche, just be weary, alright? And don't use the internet. Buy a book, but wait, you gotta make sure it's a version his sister didn't get her hands on. But just don't do it. I do recommend this. Wikipedia. Here's the deal, guys. When it comes to nihilism, it's always kind of hard to read. Wikipedia is about the primest choice you have here, unless you have a tutor on hand somewhere, and I don't count. Anyway, if you're interested in the broad philosophy of Elfen Lied, I recommend a short story called Razor by Vladimir Nabokov, which is about a very high-tension shave. It's excellent for its 4-page length and its themes of cruelty, revenge, and most of all, helplessness. So that's it for now. But don't worry, I already have a slow roast going for my next knowledge-based dish.